Right. Hi, everyone. This is Alexander Lim, and welcome to another episode of Author Story. Our featured book this episode is Can You Outsmart an Economist? 100 Puzzles to Train Your Brain, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. And for this episode, I'm interviewing the author, of course, Stephen Landsburg, who is an economist who is presently teaching at the University of Rochester in New York, where he also received an undergraduate degree and has written and remarked upon various topics since 1966. Can You Outsmart an Economist is his eighth book, so he's well experienced. He's a very experienced author. So, Stephen, welcome to Author Story. Thank you very much for being our guest.
And thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So, Stephen, first, I must say, this is the first time in the history of Author Story that we've had what some folks would call a puzzle book. But I mean, these puzzles aren't your everyday kind of puzzles since they're related to teaching economics. Is this correct?
Yeah, well, they're puzzles that are meant to sort of train your brain to think in the ways that economists think and to use some of the tools of economics, thinking about incentives, thinking about the problems that other people are trying to solve, and using those insights to try to understand better why people behave the way they do. Presented in the form of brain teasers, which, in addition to being educational, are intended to be a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, like you're a professor of economics, so you're a master of economics, I would imagine. But puzzles, I mean, do you really like puzzles that much that you would make a book on these?
Well, I love puzzles, and I think a lot of people do too. There are a lot of wonderful puzzle books out there. I was inspired partly by there are these books by Raymond Smullyan, which are puzzle books, just full of fun puzzles, but which actually teach you a lot of mathematical logic as you go along. And he found a big audience for those books, and I thought if he could do that for mathematical logic, I could do it for economics.
Yeah, why not? Okay, cool. So about the book, what made you decide to write Can You Outsmart an Economist? Was it something that you decided to write after a moment of inspiration, or was it something that you had to think over like for several years before you finally start to write it out?
Well, many of these puzzles are things that I'd been thinking about for several years, and some of them I've thought about for many years, some of them just much more recently. But the idea of presenting it as a puzzle book, I frankly can't remember when I first had that idea. I certainly like to present a lot of these things to my students as puzzles.
Hmm.
Pointing to something in the real world where people are doing things that don't seem on the surface to make sense, and convert that into a puzzle about how could it in fact make sense that people are behaving in these ways.
Right.
So students enjoy that, and also I've been blogging for a long time, and my blog readers always respond well when I present things as puzzles, and so all of that feedback led me to think this would be a good theme for a book.
Right. And I mean, it does drive home the point and does keeps people interested in the subject of economics, which I mean, let's face it, not many people are really, think consider economics to be like a top of mind kind of subject to get into.
Well, economics here, I want you. You should interpret the word pretty broadly. It's not
Okay.
just about financial markets. It's not just about industrial organization and tax policy and things like that.
Hmm.
It's about understanding other people's behavior through the lens of saying that, if we see people doing things that don't seem to make sense to us,
Hmm.
but if we think about the incentives they were facing, and if we think about the constraints they were facing, sometimes we can make sense out of behavior that otherwise seems a little bit strange. Should maybe I should give you an example or two.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. I mean,
Uh, so here is an example from the book, and again, this may be a little outside the box of what you'd ordinarily think of as economics, but
right,
it really is an economics question.
right.
I'm a college teacher.
Okay,
At the end of each semester, my students fill out evaluation forms that say how they liked the class and how they liked me as an instructor.
right,
Every college teacher in America faces the same thing. Probably around the world, they face the same thing.
right.
And there is a great deal of data showing that physically beautiful teachers, on average, get higher ratings than ordinary looking teachers.
Okay.
And So the puzzle is what explains this. And the obvious answer, the obvious simple answer, is that somehow students are very shallow and they're swayed by physical beauty, even though it's irrelevant, etc. The whole theme of this book is not to settle for a simple explanation like that, but to look a little bit deeper and find a more rational story underlying the facts. And in this case, the story, which I believe is the correct story, is that physically beautiful people, on average, really are better teachers. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that physically beautiful people have a lot of job opportunities that other people don't have. They, not just in modeling, not just in the movies, but in retail, in anything where you have to deal with the public, physical beauty is an advantage. So a physically beautiful person who went into teaching, on average, gave up a lot of other good opportunities in order to be a teacher. And on average, that's going to be somebody who loves teaching, and people who love teaching are going to be good at it.
Right.
On the other hand, the more ordinary looking teacher, again, there are going to be exceptions in all directions, but on average, the more ordinary looking teacher is more likely to have gone into teaching just because there were no other opportunities. They couldn't be a model. They couldn't be a highly successful salesperson, so they became a teacher. They, on average, are going to be less enthusiastic, and on average, they're not going to be as good a teacher. So when we look beyond the obvious, when we look at the incentives and the opportunities people were facing, we get a deeper explanation for things that look a little bit mysterious, and that's a very typical example of the kind of thing you'll find in this book.
Right. Okay. And that brings up an interesting point. I mean, I remember when I took up basic economics back in school. I mean, it was essentially like sort of like a cut and dried statistical kind of presentation of economics, but with this one, you really bring in like human biases, the way people think, the way people act, and it really brings it into the field of economics.
The way people think and act, and also the way animals think and act. I mean, there's a puzzle in this book about what happens when you take a very strong pig and a very weak pig and put them in a box and make them compete for food. And this is a question you can answer with pure economic theory, although the biologists have gone ahead and done the experiment, and it confirms what the economists would predict. You take the strong pig and the weak pig, you put them in a box. There's a lever at one end of the box and a food bowl at the other.
Okay.
If a pig presses the lever, the bowl fills up with food.
Okay.
Now the question is, who's going to eat better, the strong pig or the weak pig? The obvious answer is the strong pig is going to push the weak pig around and take most of the food.
Right, right.
The non-obvious answer is exactly the opposite, because the lever is at one end of the box, the food bowl's at the other. If the strong pig pushes the lever, the weak pig will wait by the bowl, eat most of the food until the strong pig comes running along, pushes him out of the way, and gets the last 15% of the food. On the other hand, if the weak pig pushes the lever, he never gets any food at all, because the strong pig waits by the bowl and guards the food and won't let the weak pig have any. So the weak pig has no incentive to push the lever. It's a question of looking at incentives. The weak pig has no incentive to push the lever, because if he pushes the lever, the strong pig will get all the food.
Right.
The strong pig has an incentive to push the lever because he is able to, even though the weak pig gets most of the food, he's able to run down there and steal a little bit of food from him. So it ends up that the strong pig does all the work, the strong pig gets 15% of the food, and the weak pig is the winner. Again, something that you would not think of immediately, but you would think of if you were trained to always think about incentives and opportunities the way economists do. You think about that problem through the lens of economics, you reason to the right answer, and then you discover that when the biologists do the experiment, that's exactly, in fact, how it turns out.
Wow, it's sort of like, it's like the merger of theory and what actually really happens in the real world.
It is, and again, I can give you many more examples, but they're all tied to the real world, some of them in areas that you think of traditionally as economics, and some of them not. There are things about how people decide what children to adopt, how their family sizes, when to divorce, when to marry. but also things on the price of bread and the pricing of television sets and how to best organize an economy and why political questions, why do coal miners get so much attention from politicians? Fast food cooks get almost none. Politicians are always looking for what can we do to make lives better for coal miners. They're never asking that about fast food cooks, although fast food cooks have salaries much lower than those of coal miners on average, and they don't have very, very good jobs. Why do politicians fawn over the coal miners but not over the fast food cooks? Again, looks a little mysterious on the surface until you think about the incentives people are facing. And the answer in this case is that there are a limited number of coal miners, and that's not going to expand because there are a limited number of coal mines. So anything you do to benefit coal miners has a good chance of actually benefiting coal miners. Whereas if you do something to benefit fast food cooks, what's going to happen is more people will be willing to be fast food cooks. More restaurants will open up, restaurants will expand, there will be more fast food cooks. The more fast food cooks will tend to bid down wages, and the existing fast food cooks will not benefit that much because new entrants to the occupation will steal a lot of those benefits. There's no reason that existing fast food cooks should fight for benefits that are going to go to people who are only going to become fast food cooks after the benefits come into the picture. Coal miners don't face that so much, and that's why you would expect coal miners to fight for more favors than fast food cooks fight for. This is why all over the world, farmers get a lot more benefits from their governments than, say, motel owners do. It's hard for new farmers to come into existence because there's a limited amount of farmland. New motels open up all the time. So if motel owners fight for political favors, most of those favors are going to go to people who decide after the fact to open a motel. If farmers fight for political favors, most of those favors go to the farmers, and that's why farmers get more favors.
Right. So it's really, I mean, it's really all about incentives. What people can get out of it. I mean, that's essentially the lens that these puzzles should be seen through. Is this correct?
That's correct. That works through all of these. All of the themes of economics: incentives, information, learning about, realizing that not everybody has the same information as everybody else, and figuring out how that can affect their strategic behavior, the way they interact with each other. All of that comes into play.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned before, I never thought about economics this way, but after going through some of the puzzles, it's like, it may not seem to be, related, but it does teach something.
Sure. I mean, shall I keep giving you examples? Or?
Well, not to give away the entire book, but
okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Here's another one. There are parts of the world where we know from all sorts of evidence that the majority of parents prefer sons to daughters. For whatever cultural or economic reasons there are, they prefer sons to daughters. Puzzle is, in those countries, in those places, what do you expect to see at the adoption agencies? Will people mostly be asking to adopt boys or mostly be asking to adopt girls? Now, the simple, obvious answer is if people prefer sons, then they'll be asking for boys. The correct answer is that for the most part, they ask for girls. And if you think a little bit more deeply, there's a clear reason for that based on incentives and information and all the other things that economists think about. Namely, in a country where people really prefer sons, sons will rarely be put up for adoption, even if they are difficult children, even if they have behavioral problems, health problems. Parents will hang on to them because they're so glad to have a son. Daughters, on the other hand, even when they're perfectly healthy, perfectly well behaved, sometimes they'll end up in the adoption agencies just because the parents didn't want a daughter. And therefore, at the adoption agencies, the daughters will, on average, be healthier, better behaved than the boys are. Parents who are looking to adopt will have thought this through, and they will realize that if they want a healthy, well-behaved child, their chances are a lot better with a girl than with a boy. And so even if they, in the abstract, would prefer a boy, they're going to tend to ask for girls, and that, again, is what we actually see.
Okay, that's interesting. And, And again, this is this for me, this is like an example of a cultural question that actually has can be solved through the prism of benefit. I mean, of what they can get, what people can get out of it, which is
And
essentially
and
economics.
and the theme here is that all human behavior, I mean, of course, we want to think about culture, we want to think about all sorts of things like that,
Mm,
but we will always think better and more deeply if we also account for incentives, information, opportunities, and what's going on in people's minds as they try to uh, wend their way through life and find better ways of dealing with the problems that they're facing. I think it makes you a more empathetic person when you think this way because it trains you to look at other people's behavior. It looks a little screwy, but it forces you to put yourself in their shoes and ask, well, what problem are they really trying to solve? And when you do that, not only do you understand their behavior better, but I think you end up caring about them a little more because you've understood more of the problems they're facing. And I think it makes you a better person in that sense, too.
well, yeah, and for me, that's also another interesting point because I mean, uh, I, myself included, I'm sure we tend to think of economics being cut and dried statistical sort of thing. Doesn't deal with the you know the biases and the culture and all that stuff of human existence, but it does. It does.
And when you say statistical kinds of things are not all that cut and dried either. There are many, many puzzles in this book where I present some statistics that appear to prove one thing, and in fact, when you look at them a little bit more deeply, they prove exactly the opposite. There are many, many puzzles of that form. So there are a lot of puzzles in here that will train you to interpret statistics a lot more subtly and a lot more accurately than you would if you just took a surface view.
Right, right. Okay. And it's definitely taking as you mentioned, we get into deeper into what it is to be human. I mean, the human experience with quite a few of these puzzles.
Yeah, again, I hope so. And there are many puzzles that involve statistical analysis, many puzzles that involve just thinking about incentives, many
Right,
puzzles that, many, many different kinds of puzzles.
right, right. Uh, I just want to circle back a little bit. You mentioned some concepts that you speak of here, like incentives and I'm sorry, I don't remember the others, but you mentioned quite a few of them. Can you
Well, there are
mention them?
chapters on incentives,
All
chapters
right.
uh, on making predictions,
Mm-hmm.
on explanations, looking at behavior that looks a little strange and trying to explain why people do those things.
Right.
Sometimes looking at behavior which to an untrained eye does not look mysterious, but when
Mm-hmm.
you think about it a little more deeply, you realize that it's more mysterious than it looks, and then trying to think about the questions that raises. Uh, I recently bought a television set, a Sony television set, and I was surprised to discover that it's exactly the same price no matter where I shop, on the web, at Best Buy, at the discount stores.
Right.
Turns out Sony enforces that. If you're a Sony retailer and you don't charge the list price,
Mm-hmm.
they'll stop providing television sets to you. And that, on the surface, might look like it makes perfectly good sense. Sony's trying
Right.
to keep up the price of television sets.
Right.
But if you look a little deeper, it's kind of mysterious because Sony doesn't care about the retail price of television sets. They care about the wholesale price, which they
Right.
control completely. If they sell a television set to Best Buy for 2,000, why should they care whether Best Buy resells it for 2,500 or 3,000 or 3,500?
Right.
The the answer is that they're trying to combat a real problem they have, which is that sometimes people like me go to Best Buy where all the different models are on display,
Right.
spend a couple of hours looking at all the television sets, take up a lot of the salesman's time asking a lot of questions,
Mm-hmm.
and then run next door to the discount place to actually buy the television set at a lower price.
Mm-hmm.
The result of that, if that continues, is that Best Buy is going to choose to stop carrying Sony televisions. They don't want to spend all that time educating customers who are going to buy elsewhere. And
Right.
Sony cares about that. They don't want Best Buy to stop carrying their televisions. And that's why they keep the prices up, not because they care directly about the retail price,
Mm-hmm.
but because they're afraid that the discount seller will steal customers from Best Buy, and as a result, Best Buy will stop educating customers. That's the deeper reason. That's what's really going on in Sony's mind there.
Okay. So it's really again. I mean, this is really more about excuse me about human behavior than and how it affects economics. I'm just curious, Stephen, has this human aspect been handled this way for some time in economics, mainstream
Well,
economics?
I think it's the way that all mainstream economists think about economics. We think of it as a tool that will help us understand, ideally, everything that people do. And is it the only tool that helps you understand human behavior? Of course not. There are other tools that are also valuable. But this is a tool that anytime anybody makes a decision, they were facing some incentives, they were facing some payoffs, and those incentives and payoffs had something to do with the decision they made. It might not completely explain it, but they had something to do with it. And if you can understand those incentives a little better, then that's going to help you understand the person a little better.
Wow, that's very interesting, and definitely that I think a lot of folks have to realize that because for me, that I can speak in for myself. That's not part of my normal conversation.
Well, then I hope that if it's not part of your normal conversation, that's exactly why I wrote the book, in order to share
Exactly.
these ideas and thoughts with a broader audience. And I think not only does it help me understand the world a little better, but look, these are puzzles, and puzzles are fun, and it
Yeah.
can be treated just as a fun exercise in its own right. And that's also part of what I want to share with people. I have so much fun with this stuff, and when you have fun with something, you want to share it with people.
Right. Right. So I really have to ask Stephen, among all the puzzles in your book, is there any one puzzle that's a big favorite of yours? Like, this is really something else.
Well, I've given you several
Yeah.
that I like a lot. I'm not sure there's any one I can pick out. It's a little
Okay.
like asking a person to choose among his children.
Okay.
But there
Got that.
there are so many with so many different themes and styles and flavors that I think I'd be loath to just pick out one. No
Right.
one of them is really representative.
Right. Okay. 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 I got that. So, Stephen, let's say you came across someone who's kind of interested in economics, who, maybe someone like me who hasn't considered the interplay of human factors where economics is concerned. And you had only this guy doesn't know anything about that, and you had only enough time to tell that person one thing about the interplay of the human aspect of things with economics. What would be that one thing you tell that person?
I would tell him that it always pays to look beyond the obvious. That the obvious, simple explanations for behavior are often the wrong explanations,
Mm,
and that the best tool for looking beyond the obvious is to think hard about the incentives that other people are facing, and how they are the problems that those incentives are presenting to them. And what would you do in their shoes if you were facing those same incentives and those same difficulties? That's often the best tool for looking beyond the obvious. And the broader part of that message is, keep an open mind. Don't just go with the first thing that pops into your head as an
right.
explanation. Criticize your own answers. Think about what might be inadequate about those answers, and why it might pay to think a little more deeply.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, great words right there. And okay, so Stephen, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any, final words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to inspire listeners?
Well, the absolute final word of wisdom I want to share is, have a look at the website, where you can read a chapter of this book for free and read
Cool.
some reviews and decide if it's the book for you. And the website to go to is outsmartaneconomist.com. That's all one word, outsmartaneconomist.com. If you
Mm,
go to outsmartaneconomist.com, you can read the first chapter for free, and you'll have, after that, I think, a much better idea whether this is the book for you.
right. I mean, definitely. I mean, this for me is definitely an interesting marriage between puzzles and economics. I'm sure a lot of folks are going to pick up a lot of things from this.
I hope so.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So then, in closing, the book is Can You Outsmart an Economist? 100 Plus Puzzles to Train Your Brain. The authors are guest Stephen Landsburg, and you can get his entire book at Amazon. You can also check out one chapter, as he mentioned, in outsmartaneconomist.com. So, Stephen, thank you very much for being on Author Story. I must say, for me, it's very eye-opening particularly as far as economics is concerned.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. So everyone, I invite you to go ahead and check out Can You Outsmart an Economist? And if you want to check out some other interesting authors and books, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. So I'll be back next time on our Author Story Weekly Interviews with another great book and another fantastic author.